Thank you, and I thank the program committee for giving me some time today to talk about policy and also to put me on after Jennifer. Jennifer's actually my lawyer, and we've never met in person, so that's pretty cool. Thank you very much for that. Where is the clicker? There we go. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about policy and why I'm hoping you guys, especially right now, will keep a close eye on what is happening regarding cybersecurity policy right now. A little bit of background on me. My name's Dawson. I'm Executive Director of the Internet Infrastructure Coalition. The stuff that we're going to talk about today, I want to talk about how the US government is looking at cybersecurity. In order to properly frame this, though, I have to really quickly explain a little bit about who I am. My background is in web hosting. I went from that to help found an organization that focuses on policy work for companies that rack and stack servers and data centers that sit above the telco layer. So we're talking about registries, registrars, cloud providers. Most of our organizations are under the jurisdiction of the FTC, not the FCC. So a lot of the examples that I'm going to end up using today are centered around things that aren't in the FCC realm, and I know that there are a lot of telcos here that are primarily governed by the FCC. So when we're talking about cybersecurity regulation, I'm not going to be going over the things that the FCC is doing. They've got really extensive work. They've got the Communications Security Reliability and Interoperability Council. They've got the Communications Sector Coordinating Council, the CSRIC and CSCC, and a whole bunch of interesting cyber stuff is happening within those communities. A whole bunch of interesting rulings have been handed down, and we're going to cover none of that today. But they're still important for you guys to keep a close eye on. I'm mostly focusing on my attention on areas of interest that I'm keeping an eye on from the perspective of the data centers, the hosting providers. The general concepts, though, that we're going to illustrate are hopefully going to be important to you, whether you are a telco or whether you are in the stacks that is more heavily regulated by the FTC. So I want to talk about how the government's looking at cybersecurity right now. We're going to talk about what the US government considers critical infrastructure, because things are changing right now. Cybersecurity regulation is changing in great part because they're taking a very close look at how the internet needs to be governed as critical infrastructure. So we're going to talk about what that means. We're going to talk about how the NIST Cybersecurity Framework plays a role in new requirements, and how internet providers can take an active role in ensuring that good decisions get made. So a really brief overview of why this stuff is really important right now. In late 2016, the US House Energy and Commerce Committee began a series of cybersecurity hearings in response to IoT security problems. We've been talking about that for a while now. The Dyn incident basically started a cascade of legislators who wanted to find out answers to why you couldn't get to banking websites and things that they wanted to make sure were up and running. And then there was the Russian hacking incident with our elections. And in early 2017, the US Senate Armed Services Committee followed suit. And they started calling hearings to talk about what we needed to do about cybersecurity. So it started putting the kinds of organizations that we operate on the hot seat to start having conversations with legislators. My job is mostly trying to explain to legislators how the internet works. And so I've spent a lot of time over the past couple of months trying to bring people up to speed on top level, basically general concepts, things that you'd be embarrassed to realize that legislators don't understand. Those types of things are getting them just this much, just a tiny bit closer to being able to make smart decisions about how we should handle cyber. But they need a lot more. They need a lot more in order to make smart decisions, and that's where you guys are going to come in. But we're going to go through a little timeline of why this is especially needed right now. So, like I said, November 16th, they had the hearing in the House Energy and Commerce Committee in regard to the aftermath of the Dyn attack. On January 6th, DHS labeled election equipment as critical infrastructure over fears of Russian hacking. When we talk about how we're going to start having conversations about how more of our network services are going to be considered critical infrastructure and what that means, it starts with the conversation that they were having on January 6th, where they took a look at voting machines and systems that are connected to voting machines, and they decided to start labeling them critical infrastructure. That's starting a broader conversation about how much that should cascade into other areas of other networks. On January 7th, the day after that, James Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, got up and he framed cyber threats as challenging public trust and confidence in global institutions, governments, and norms. That cyber threats impose tremendous costs on the global economy, that they pose an increasing risk to public safety, and that they undermine U.S. military and commercial advantage by hacking into U.S. defense industry and commercial enterprises. This is important because up until then, we were really mostly talking at a 10,000-foot level about what we were going to do from a cyber perspective by listening to agencies like NIST and the FTC and the FCC. And the conversation has started to shift around national intelligence so that all of a sudden now a lot of the conversation is being driven by the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense, who are framing things as we need to get a handle on critical infrastructure for the defense of our country. It's upping the ante on what is ultimately going to come down as requirements for our industry. January 24th, the House Energy and Commerce Committee listed cybersecurity oversight as one of their top goals in the 115th Congress. And on January 30th, 2017, a draft cybersecurity executive order that was being considered by the White House was leaked. I read a copy of that cybersecurity order. I don't know if any of the rest of you read a copy of that. I believe that there is a second copy that is out there somewhere. I've not read the new copy. The first one mostly focused attention on requirements of departments in the federal government to follow the NIST Cybersecurity Framework or be held accountable to the executive, to basically accountable to the president, that the actual secretary of the agency, if they didn't get all of their systems up to date, they were going to be held accountable personally for that. And this is the environment that we're in today. If you want me to be incredibly speculative and use language that I've heard from other people, like I said, the Department of Homeland Security and Department of Defense have a much bigger role to play these days. They have the ear of the president. Under the last president, we were listening to NIST, FTC, and FCC. It was collaborate and self-guide. It was work with industry. And there's a feeling now that it's going to be more, you do this or we'll throw you in jail. And oh yeah, don't necessarily talk about what we're asking you to do. Right now, internet service companies are assured to have new responsibilities imposed upon them. But the conversations now are how extensive the new responsibilities are going to be and who they're going to apply to. Like I said, we're going to start with issues surrounding critical infrastructure. So let's talk about what critical infrastructure is. Critical infrastructure is a term used by governments to describe assets that are essential for the functioning of a society and economy, and hence require special federal oversight, protection, and regulation. I'm not going to go through all 16 critical infrastructure sectors. The important thing to note is that, like I said, my background is not in the communications sector. It's in the information technology sector, but both are extremely relevant and both are being heavily talked about right now. My examples are going to rest in the IT sector. In 1998, a program was set up for critical infrastructure protection, and the DHS had a sector-specific agency set up for the IT sector. Today's IT sector-specific plan is focused on self-organized, self-run, and self-governed private sector, IT sector coordinating councils to help formulate its plan. Most of the things that come out of these groups are industry-driven and part of a public-private partnerships that has, to this point, worked very effectively. They've had some groups they've had some important programs that have come out of there. The Cyberstorm Exercise Series, the Software and Supply Chain Assurance Working Group, the IT Sector Risk Assessment. But the one I want to focus on today is the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, which was heavily referenced in the draft cybersecurity executive order that I mentioned before. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework it provides a policy framework of computer security guidance for how private sector organizations can assess and improve their ability to prevent, detect, and respond to cyber attacks. It provides a high-level taxonomy of cybersecurity outcomes and a methodology to assess and manage those outcomes. The framework is voluntary guidance based on existing standards, guidelines, and practices for critical infrastructure organizations. And it was designed to foster risk and cybersecurity management communications among both internal and external organization stakeholders. So we're talking about government IT, we're also talking about industry IT. And most of these things were created in conjunction with one another, relying heavily upon existing standards. That's generally positive, and that's generally what we want. When we start moving out of the realm of what is voluntary, we need to take a look at specific standards with a level of expertise that I, as somebody whose job it is to go up to Congress and to help advocate for where we should be headed, don't have the way that you guys who run networks have. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. I'm going to go through two brief overviews of NIST guidelines. The first is the CIS Critical Security Controls. This is 1 through 5 of 20 critical security controls that are a part of the overall NIST guidelines. Basically says you need to maintain an inventory of authorized and unauthorized devices, maintain an inventory of authorized and unauthorized software, maintain continuous vulnerability assessment, maintain controlled use of administrative privileges. Honestly, like any organization, even a small 5-person organization, somebody who's starting up at their basement, could probably follow these criteria and be better off for it. Here's another example. The ISA IEC 62443. Very much more complicated, and the important part of it here is this requires an audit process that can be somewhat extensive and costly. When we start talking about who is going to be required to do what in cybersecurity, we've got a very good framework in the NIST CSF. But who it gets applied to and how matters to who gets to continue to be an internet provider and who doesn't. Because going ahead and telling people that they need to follow the CIS critical security controls is very different than telling a 5-person organization that they need to comply with ISA IEC 62443. These are examples of why these conversations matter to how we can continue to operate internet companies and why we need to be a part of the conversation. That being said, because I'm not operating networks on an ongoing basis, I actually don't have the insight to properly engage government officials about who this should apply to in what context and how. That's another reason why the people that are operating networks need to be focused on policy so that they can properly advise government officials who are making these critical decisions what these answers need to be. In the coming months and years, lawmakers and executive and legislative branches are likely to be deciding whether voluntary NIST CSF is sufficient to be the framework required for parts of the internet that become considered critical infrastructure. We're likely to be asking questions at the federal and legislative level. Is voluntary compliance with existing standards, guidelines, and practices sufficient? At what point is voluntary not enough? And what organizations need what standards in order to ensure the safety of the internet as a whole? Answers to these questions can change global network health, and that's good. It can make it so that we raise the bar for everybody on cybersecurity. That's fantastic. But it can also change cost structures, and it can change who gets to be an internet provider and who doesn't. So as politicians decide answers to these questions, internet provider voices can help determine whether their desires are aligned with reality. Engaged parties will have opportunities to contribute to course corrections. Now, what's difficult right now is because these conversations are just getting started, I can't tell you, you need to contact so-and-so and have this conversation right now. All I can do is say, right now, keep your ear to the ground, because these conversations are beginning and they're going to be important. I can start to give you some resources, but I can't give you something to go do today other than to bone up on this important stuff. Consider a legislative strategy as part of your cybersecurity strategy and your business continuity strategy. For direct contact with relevant legislators, you can start with the Energy and Commerce Department of the House of Representatives, where a good deal of these conversations are starting strongest right now. Additional resources. You can find out more about NIST at nist.gov. The Cybersecurity Framework that I talked about is at nist.gov/cyberframework. The Center for Internet Security, cisecurity.org, and the Cloud Security Alliance do a lot of good work in this area. My organization does a lot of good work in advocacy in this area as well. So those are additional resources that you can use to learn more and engage in the conversation if you're not interested in doing it directly. Ultimately, we simply need you guys to figure out the right answers to make sure that the decisions that get made that affect your network comport with reality and affect the positive change that we need them to, because honestly right now, whether we like it or not, change is coming. And solutions get made by the people that show up at the table to solve those problems. Without you guys at the table, problems have a chance of not getting solved efficiently and of negatively impacting the industry as a whole. So I hope you guys find a way to do that, and I'm here to take questions.
Matt Petak, Yahoo. This is very good. I think one of the challenges that we tend to face is you're asking us to come and show up at the table so the right decisions get made, and we're looking around going, where's the table?
Yeah.
And that's actually the heart of the problem, is not that we don't want to get engaged, not that we don't want to speak up and say, holy crap, some of the things you're presenting here are downright terrifying. We don't really want the Department of Homeland Security breathing down our necks on every decision we make on our internal inventory management systems and the like. But we're not sure what the right table is to show up and say, hang on, if you've got concerns, talk to us, let us know what you'd like to see, but we don't want people with guns coming in and telling us how to run our organizations.
Sure. So I'm going to give you a couple of different answers. And because there's not one right answer, and certainly not one right answer for every company, the one thing that I'm going to need to do is advocate for going out there and doing research where you feel like you can best contribute. I mentioned from an FCC perspective that they've got the Communication Security and Reliability and Interoperability Council. They've also got the Communications Sector Coordinating Council. At the NIST, of course, you can get involved directly in NIST and work directly with that organization as a business advocate in order to try to affect change there. When it comes to legislative engagement, I gave the House Energy and Commerce website because creating relationships with legislative officials that are in positions of power to affect change is really the best way, unless you're getting involved with trade associations like the three I mentioned, one of which was mine, whose job it is to keep a constant eye on this thing. Because honestly, like, what'll happen is a bill will get dropped, it'll be out there for a month, or maybe a day in some cases, and there will be some conversation. Only the people that are really plugged in are really going to know about it and have an opportunity to comment and make sure that the smart things are happening before things come to a vote. So it really depends on what your tolerance is for getting involved. If you really want to get into the nuts and bolts, go directly with the organizations that are building the frameworks themselves.
Do you think it behooves us as an industry to have a more focused and organized, hey, we're NANOG, we're a lobbying body now, and we want to come and represent ISPs throughout the North American region as a whole, or are we better to show up as individual companies?
So there are lobby organizations that represent different aspects of the community here. It might make sense to have some coordinating function where you go ahead and you say, like, okay, the ISP groups and the cloud groups, who are working on this thing, don't duplicate their efforts, but amplify their efforts. That could make a lot of sense.
Gotcha, thank you.
Austin Carr, Southern Light. What are you hearing from the legislators about pushing this down to the grassroots level at the states level? And what I mean by that is, for example, I know the National Guard states are beginning to build some of their own cyber teams and cyber capabilities. Are they seeing that as something to enhance this program? And I ask that because, to Matt's question, that may be a table for us to go to as a LAC or an ISP to our states instead of having to try go all the way to the top.
Sure.
What are you hearing on that level?
So there's a constant push and pull when it comes to various aspects of internet policy with regards to how things should operate at state or federal levels. In general, there has been a wide sort of, a lot of people in Congress and most of the tech industry has not wanted a Swiss cheese approach to dealing with tech policy. Some governments have said, well, you're not doing enough on privacy or you're not doing enough on security, so I need to take matters into their own hands. And you have seen over the past couple of years, particularly regarding cyber privacy issues, that California stepped up and said that they needed to create their own rules and regulations. Texas has started talking about needing to create their own cybersecurity rules and regulations. In general, if we can get sensible approaches happening at the federal level, it's much easier for everybody. And generally, the states are really only stepping up to do that if they think that the job just isn't getting done at a federal level.
Thank you.
Oh, sir, yes.
Hi, Jeff Osborne, ISC. One of the dirty little secrets of the internet and the governance of it is that there are some underfunded, understaffed open source projects that are sort of the bottom layer of the Jenga stack that is the internet. And Heartbleed was a good example of it recently. I think to some degree the Dyn difficulties in the fall were. And I've said 1,000 times, probably to half the people in this room, open source is an unproven business model. And in classical economics, they're called externalities, and it's a classic role for government to step in and provide roads, police, and I'd like to think funding for some parts of open source, because the commercial markets aren't necessarily doing it to a level that is commensurate with the importance of them. So that's a lot of words to say. Do you think there's anybody in the federal government with an appetite to write some shockingly small checks to prevent some shockingly terrifying outcomes?
It's something, I also got to participate at a panel on Monday, and somebody came up with, they stood up to the mic and they talked about the idea of addressing IoT security problems by the creation of an IoT software solution that was extremely secure and easy to use, that could be a way to drive, to make things more stable and secure from that perspective. The answer is there very well may be, and it's going to take people in positions like ours stepping up and say, no guys, this is the way that you solve this problem in order to make that happen. One thing that was in the existing executive order that I did see that the president is likely to sign in the coming week, at least the original draft, I have no idea what's in the current draft, was the creation of a private incentives study, where they wanted to go to private industry and they wanted to find out what incentives could be built into systems to make them more secure. If we bring those ideas to the people that are putting together that study, it's distinctly possible that shockingly small checks could start flowing and it could make things better. Sure.
Thank you.
I think we've reached time. So I thank you very much.